Our next speaker is Phil Pylant, who's a pharmacist and clinical nutritionist, although both of those terms sort of sound meager in comparison to his services that he performs for us. He was educated at the University of Houston, the College of Pharmacy. He is certified by the International and American Associations of Clinical Nutritionists, and he has worked for years as a key teaching advisor to these organizations. Over the 41 years, his CME experience has been broad and intensive, with lectures given in multiple topics: bone metabolism, infections, hormones, compounding specialties, the list goes on, and the conferences that he's attended give him a broad base from which to speak. He is a major force in the professionalization of compounding pharmacies and the old style. That's the way people used to do it. The pharmacist worked with the doctor to get the program that you needed. And his was the first PCAB accredited pharmacy in Houston. That means that his standards were the highest, and he continues to maintain those. He's the owner and sleeves rolled up, hands-on operator of the pace-setting Village Compounding Pharmacy in West Houston. And I am thrilled to present to you Phil Pylant to present a set of perspectives on major toxic heavy metals, especially lead and mercury.
The toxin that we're going to deal with are heavy metals, but heavy metals are not the only thing we need to worry about. We need to worry about the petrochemicals, like right underneath this building, organic solvents, toluene, and all these types of things. Even, ethyl alcohol, what we drink, is an organic solvent. Too much ethyl alcohol causes liver damage. Pesticides, they have a heavy metal component along with them. Of course, pharmaceuticals, ultraviolet radiation, EMFs and EMRs. That's electromagnetic fields or electromagnetic radiation. This is an area that's becoming of great concern now. Most of us don't even realize what's happening here, but it's happening to us without our knowledge. And that is, we are being bombarded by these electrical fields that are very, very unhealthy, that actually cause oxidative stress, maybe even more than anything else. And just to give you an example of something you won't hear anyplace else, when they did that study on the EMFs or EMRs for this brain damage supposedly that cell phones were doing in, I think it was Sweden, they had a control group that didn't use them, and then the experimental group that did. And after the study was over, they concluded no difference in brain function, no difference in the amount of brain cancer. So everybody says, okay, well fine, we're just real safe now. But what they didn't tell you is this, is that they allowed the control group who wasn't using the cell phones to use cordless phones. Now, cordless phones have the same problem as the cell phones. So the study was basically flawed. So we're sitting here thinking it's really safe to be using these cell phones, no brain cancer, and yet you're doing it off of a flawed study. Genetically modified foods. What they're finding is that, in a sense, that people who didn't have gluten sensitivity, or it wasn't so severe, it's becoming more and more severe. And why is that? Genetically modified foods are increasing the gluten content in the wheat. So, if you have celiac disease and you haven't been tested, of course I would hope, if you have that you are working on gluten sensitivities. But if you don't, and all of a sudden you start having some symptoms, maybe it's because you just had that little tipping point of the gluten, because these genetically modified foods, the production of the gluten is higher. So, that's something you need to know. What can we do about this? Well, you really can't avoid completely, but you can reduce your exposure. Detoxify regularly. And, by chelation is one way. Some of the oral pharmaceuticals that Dr. Trowbridge uses is another way. You can do some of your own self-help, but it's a lot lighter, so it's safer. But if you get into some heavy detoxification, you really need to seek out a healthcare provider, because for one thing, when you actually start doing some pretty heavy-duty chelation and heavy-duty detox, you got to know if your kidney function is proper. There's been some problems with doctors who didn't understand that the creatinine clearance, you got to know that stuff. Otherwise, you can deposit some of the heavy metals in the kidneys and cause severe damage. So just be aware that you should consult somebody like Dr. Trowbridge if you're really going to do some heavy-duty detoxification. So my lecture today, it's going to be on lead and mercury, but they apply to all of the heavy metals except aluminum. And that's the reason being is that heavy metals have a +2 valence. And when you chelate, the +2 and the -2 correspond and you pull it out. But there aren't anything around with +3 valences to pull out. So how do you get aluminum out? Well, you can get maybe some of it out with some chelation, but not much. So you got to look to things like possibly far infrared saunas. Anybody is the word foreign to you, far infrared saunas? Boy, that is a really good way to get rid of the environmental toxins. Not as much the heavy metals, you can get some, but the other ones that we were discussing. Far infrared saunas. The human body was designed to anticipate and successfully cope with most toxic exposures, including mercury. So we have these coping abilities in the body that are natural coping abilities that are provided to us just by being a human being. But then something begins to happen, and that is we overwhelm these things. So a good friend of mine says, the body is designed to win. So many of the compensatory actions that many people think are bad are really one step away from moving your health into a positive position. So when the body's compensating, you think something is wrong. Yeah, it feels bad, but it's trying to compensate for something that's wrong. And so it's always compensating, trying to win. Repeated exposures overwhelm the body's ability to respond, and I call it uncoupling the coping. Uncoupling the coping is what we do with repeated exposures. A lady came into me about 4 years ago. I'll call her Jody, just her name wasn't Jody, but I'll just say Jody came to see me. Was sent to me by somebody that said I was, pretty good at understanding detoxification and blah, blah, blah. And so she came in, she's about 250 pounds or more. She brought her acupuncturist with her so he could listen to what I was talking to her about. She began to explain her problem, and I said, oh my gosh. I said, I don't know if I'm capable of taking care of this. And she was beginning to limp. She was overweight and hadn't been overweight. And she said, I'm at the end. She said, I don't know what else to do. She said, I've been everywhere. And I said, let's discuss your history. She said, discuss my history? What do you mean? I said, let's find out where you were when you were a child, where you are today. I said, where'd you grow up? She said, nobody's ever asked me that. And I said, tell me where you grew up. Baytown? I said, okay. That's one thing wrong. I said, next. My father worked in a toluene plant. I said, yeah, okay. Next. Well, tell me some more about your childhood. Tell me about it. Well, we lived in a small home, and I said, did y'all wash your clothes together with your dads? Yeah. My mom didn't know anything about that. I said, I said, that's been how long ago? 30-something years ago. I said, I said, and you're beginning to limp, which means that you've got toxicity in some of the neurons. I said, because if you're limping, you've got something wrong with the nerves. I said, you're overweight, you can't get rid of your fat because your body's coping. I'm talking about compensatory things. When you're overweight and you can't lose it, guess what the body's doing? It's hanging on for dear life for that fat, because the body stores toxins in your fat. I said, so you got a lot of toxins, you can't lose weight. Yeah. So I worked out a plan to begin, first of all, what I consider a phase 1 detox, which upregulates a system that begins the process of moving things out, which she couldn't do. And I also said, what about bowel movement? No, can't do it. I said, another nerve problem. Figured out, so I fixed up a solution for her on how to do all this. I said, okay, after you've started this other stuff to get phase 1 going, and you have gotten your bowels moving, come back. So 3 or 4 weeks later, she comes back. She said, you are not going to believe this. I said, okay, let's hear it. She said, you know, I'm finally moving my bowels. I said, okay, that's good. And she said, and you won't believe what I'm going to tell you next. I said, tell me. Every time I move my bowels, everybody in the house has to leave. You know what it smelled like? Anybody want to guess? Toluene from 30-something years ago. I was just now able to start mobilizing the toluene that had been in her for 30-something years, had been stored, was beginning to cause all kind of problems, nerve problems. She couldn't move her bowels. She couldn't lose weight. So if you think these toxins aren't really bad news, think about this poor lady. So we kind of got her worked out and got her to start losing weight, got her compensated, and she's doing pretty good now. The uncoupling of the coping impeded exit capabilities, the bowels and such. Altered genetics. Anybody heard of Wilson's disease? That's a genetic problem in which you can't get rid of copper. And so you got to use penicillamine to pull it out. That's a genetic defect. It's what we call an efflux problem. Binding proteins. You got to have some good quality protein. You got to be able to break it down with good GI. Dr. Trowbridge uses certain things to get rid of the yeast and stuff. That's part of the process of digesting protein. If we can't digest our protein, we've got a problem with binding protein. We've got to make sure our protein status is good, albumin and total protein and such, to bind this stuff. So uncoupling of the coping, if you don't have good binding protein, you got a problem. So the typical outcomes: fatigue, brain fog, poor concentration, weight change, muscle wasting, feeling of being toxic, susceptible to disease and infection. So these are the things that happen when we're just basically unable to cope. And then it even gets worse than that down the road, but this is just the non-ability to cope. So the first part of this technical information will be to show you what the body uses to cope. Metallothionein, one of the main things the body uses to protect us from heavy metals. Cell protecting. Everybody's heard of glutathione. Most people here are pretty proactive, so they've heard of glutathione. Then we got circulating protein, ApoE, which comes from eggs, albumin, hemoglobin, some protein. In every step of the way, vitamin C is important for donating these electrons to make it happen. Here's cysteine. That is an amino acid that is really the big player in all of our tissues to bind things. SH, sulfhydryl, sulfur groups. That's what does the binding. And so the cysteine is loaded with sulfhydryl groups, which binds. When the cysteine, the thiol group, the SH group, is being used to bind in an environmental toxin, it becomes unavailable for defending against free radicals produced normally by the cell. The cell experiences oxidative stress, acid stress, which goes into dysfunction. See, every time we take a breath, we create a free radical. Oxygen creates a free radical. Our bodies, when it's making energy, creates free radicals. So, under normal conditions, we have the ability to cope with these free radicals. And these free radicals are coped with by SH groups. And if these SH groups are busy, taking care of things they don't need to be taken care of, that's when you get in trouble. Okay. Mercury vapor from dental fillings becomes oxidized to ionic mercury. This is how some of this stuff can happen. Okay, ionic mercury has been shown to interact with the cysteine residues of brain tubulin, which inhibits normal polymerization, synthesis of new microtubules that are needed to make nitrite structure. Each microtubule ages and becomes dysfunctional. Boom, Alzheimer's. So metallothionein is one of the sinkholes for excess minerals and toxic metals. And it's because it has 61 amino acids, 30% which are cysteine, and gives it its unique storage ability. It's located mostly in the entry portals and places for elevated risk, brain and liver, pancreas, and ApoE from eggs. And if you're ApoE 2 or 3, you're really good. If you're ApoE 4, you shouldn't eat eggs. So if you want to genetically test, let's hope that you're ApoE 2 or 3. It is the most abundant critical of the plasma proteins, represents the largest pool of sulfhydryl groups, and not only does it bind to metals, it's an acid sponge. Hemoglobin, lots of cysteine groups. One of the problems is that when they bind to the hemoglobin, it changes the shape. It doesn't go through to the microcirculation as well, and so we've got problems like anaerobic metabolism, which is not good. Then you got selenoprotein, another coping protein for the body. You can read about that. And then glutathione. This is our major cobra, really. I mean, we've got to keep that glutathione level high. And if you take a lot of Tylenol, you're really putting yourself at risk because it depletes glutathione like nothing else. Heavy metal toxicity are a significant environmental health concern which produce many negative effects through various mechanisms. Manifested variously through individuals as signs and symptoms of chronic degenerative disease. Laboratory evaluations can identify individually specific metal toxicities. You can read about that. So why evaluate for detoxification? Well, we've been talking about it. Hundreds of millions of tons of man-made toxins poured into the environment annually. We have highly individual responses, meaning our genetics. Some people cope better than others. Sometimes it's just a light reaction, sometimes organ failure. So it just depends on your genetics and your exposure, your age, what you eat and do, kind of food you eat, exercise. There's a number of things that make a difference on whether you go to, big time down or big time up, and that's how you handle your lifestyle. The general mechanisms for toxicity promote free radical production, which is the main thing. You can read about that. That free radical production is the main problem. Does everybody know what a free radical is, by the way? I mean, people here are pretty proactive or they wouldn't be here. I just want to make sure. I just make assumptions, but a free radical is something that grabs an electron from something else because it's lost its electron, and it grabs it from a good cell, let's say, and it damages that cell, and then it's kind of a chain reaction. They just keep grabbing. That's how that works. It's like the hot potato. It just keeps passing along. Mercury, lead, arsenic are more neuro. Cadmium, lead, mercury, nephro, that's the kidneys. Cardiovascular disease, almost all of them. Immune dysfunction, they cause immune dysfunction. Osteomalacia, course, is cadmium. Y'all can read about this lead. The main sources of lead you need to know. Well, burning of storage batteries, see, it's in the air. Solder, paint. But paint, they say, okay, well, paint's not leaded anymore. Well, I know it's not leaded anymore, but it's still in you because you don't get rid of this stuff very easily. And so if you were ever around leaded paint, you still got the problem, whether you know it or not. Leaded gasoline, same as above. We don't have it anymore. Yeah, but it's still in you. And guess what those fumes coming out of those cars did? It landed in all the soil. And what if you are near a highway? You've got a lot of lead near your home. And it's probably, when the dust blows, you get it. People doing pottery glazing, leaded glass, newsprints got it, black and colored ink, ashes and fumes from old-painted wood. Now, this is one that I didn't know of, but as I was doing some of my research on the sources, it makes sense. Venison and small game, because you use lead bullets to kill them. So you can get some lead from venison and small game. And like I said, soil near the highways. Where do you find lead? All of these places. Lead and cancer. Lead interferes with the process of our monocytes to signal T cells the presence of cancer cells, hindering cancer defenses. Lead actually interferes with that. That's why heavy metals like lead, there's more cancer. It actually interferes with the signal to tell our immune system that we've got a cancer cell, go get it. Because we produce cancer cells every day of our life. If we have a great immune system, nothing happens. If not, something begins to happen. Mental status. It affects nucleotide metabolism and hemoglobin, causing fatigue and reduced mental status. Competes with calcium uptake, and calcium is a big functioner of our cells. And high blood pressure, of course. That'll cause high blood pressure. Animal studies, if exposed to lead as a newborn, there's an increase in the amyloid deposits, which they say are the thing that Alzheimer's is all about. In adulthood, little evidence of amyloid if lead exposure occurs only in adulthood. Consequences of early exposure: low birth weight is associated with adult onset coronary heart disease, beta stroke, hypertension, depression, and other conditions. So low birth weight is associated with high levels of cord, blood, arsenic, mercury, lead, solvents, and pesticides. Elegant studies by Nittleman and others confirmed that even lower doses than had been suspected, long-term learning impairment, neurologic development occurs in children. A 1993 study by Holly Ruff and colleagues found that over a 6-month period, IQs of children treated for lead rose an average of 1 point for every 0.14 micromoles per liter, and a decrease in. There's a follow-up of this third NAN survey, and here's what it says. At blood level, lead levels well below occupational exposure limit guideline, blood lead positively associated with blood pressure and systolic and diastolic hypertension. They showed that in this study. Lead stored in the bone of postmenopausal women began to increase back into the soft tissue. One of the reasons that women begin to have cardiovascular problems after menopause is that our body over the long haul stores lead in the bone. And if we go into menopause, what happens? Women begin to lose their bone, and the calcium comes out, and so does the lead. So the lead gets into our system, causes damage to our artery. The lead inhibits the production of nitric oxide, which relaxes the arteries and does a number of other things. 16-year follow-up on 4200. Conclusion: subject with blood lead levels of 20 to 29 micrograms per deciliter experienced significant increase in all-cause circulatory and cardiovascular mortality. What happens, of course, when we get this cow